London woke that morning beneath a veil of pearl-colored mist, the sort that softens stone and soot alike, lending mercy to a city that rarely offered it to women on the brink of judgment. Church bells tested their voices in distant parishes, florists lifted shutters heavy with sleep, and carriages traced damp crescents along the streets, all moving in unconscious rehearsal for a wedding that society already claimed as its own. Marriage, in that England ruled by custom more fiercely than by crown, was not a vow of affection but a public transaction, and nowhere was this understood more keenly than by Miss Arabella Finch. Arabella had been raised to stand beautifully within narrow margins. Her father's lineage was respectable, her mother's manners impeccable, yet the family fortune had thinned to a whisper, leaving her youth as the last negotiable asset. She possessed a composure learned early, the quiet discipline of a woman trained to make herself agreeable without ever seeming eager. Those who observed her saw grace, not effort, calm, not calculation. Few perceived the vigilance beneath her stillness, or the awareness that every smile carried consequence. Her engagement to His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscourt, had been received as a triumph of prudence. He was titled, solvent in name if not in truth, and in want of a bride whose connections were unblemished. Arabella, in turn, required security more than romance, and so their union had been shaped by reason, not rapture. She had accepted his proposal with steady hands and a measured heart, believing that respect might, in time, soften into something kinder. Society praised her sense. Her family praised her courage. Only Arabella questioned the cost. In the weeks preceding the ceremony, she had organized every detail with an almost reverent precision. The morning service at St. George's, Hanover Square, was chosen for its prestige rather than intimacy. The wedding breakfast would be restrained, tasteful, beyond reproach. Nothing must invite comment. Nothing must appear excessive. Arabella understood that the smallest indulgence might be interpreted as ambition, and ambition in a bride was a dangerous rumor. She labored not from joy, but from duty, stitching order into a future that must not unravel. Yet beneath the silks and schedules, London had begun to murmur. Servants exchanged glances that lingered too long. A milliner hesitated before offering congratulations. At a final call made by a well-meaning aunt, sympathy crept into her tone, thinly veiled by etiquette. Arabella felt these tremors without understanding their source. She sensed herself becoming an object of observation, examined not for beauty but for endurance, as though the city were quietly measuring how much disappointment she might bear without breaking. The Duke himself remained distant in those final days, courteous but preoccupied, his attentions divided by obligations he never fully named. When he spoke of the future, his words were careful, almost rehearsed, heavy with responsibility and light on warmth. Arabella answered in kind, meeting restraint with restraint, convincing herself that this was the language of stability. Still, in rare unguarded moments, she wondered whether affection could survive such economy, or whether she was stepping into a silence that would echo for years. On the evening before the wedding, she left her mother's drawing-room earlier than expected, citing fatigue. The house was restless with anticipation, corridors cluttered with parcels and whispered instructions. Arabella moved through it like a guest in her own life, pausing once to steady herself against the banister as laughter drifted from below. It was then she noticed a light burning in a smaller sitting room, one that should have been empty at that hour. The sight unsettled her, though she could not have said why. She approached quietly, driven less by suspicion than by an instinct she had long learned to distrust. The door was ajar. Candlelight spilled across the threshold, revealing a scene she had never imagined yet instantly understood. The Duke stood close to another woman, his posture unguarded, his expression stripped of ceremony. The woman's face was turned away, but Arabella recognized her by the curve of her shoulder, the familiar fall of her hair. It was her cousin, favored by fortune and circumstance, and in that suspended moment, the future fractured. Arabella did not cry out. She did not retreat. She stood long enough to comprehend that this was no accident of impulse but a choice rehearsed in secrecy. When she finally withdrew, the house seemed to close around her, walls thick with knowledge she could no longer escape. By morning, she understood, London would not need witnesses. It would know. And she, the bride so carefully composed, would be judged not for what had been done to her, but for how gracefully she endured it. Morning arrived without apology. London resumed its breath, as though nothing fragile had been broken in the night, and Arabella Finch rose from her sleepless vigil with the practiced composure of a woman long accustomed to swallowing pain before it reached her voice. The household stirred around her, servants moving with sharpened purpose, each step echoing the unspoken knowledge that this day was meant to confirm her worth. She dressed slowly, selecting garments chosen weeks earlier, garments meant to signal serenity. They obeyed her body, though her thoughts did not. At breakfast, her mother spoke of schedules and weather, her tone brisk with determination. The wedding, she insisted, must proceed precisely as planned. Arabella listened, her gaze steady upon her teacup, aware that silence was now a form of consent. To speak would invite chaos, to hesitate would invite speculation. The rules were clear. A woman wronged before marriage was pitted, but a woman who refused marriage was condemned. Honor, she had been taught, was not something one defended but something one endured. Before she could retreat to solitude, a footman entered bearing a lacquered box embossed with the Duke of Ravenscourt's crest. It was presented with ceremony, as though it were a sacred offering. Arabella felt the room pause, waiting for her reaction. She opened it carefully. Inside lay a necklace of rare delicacy, pearls flawless and pale, arranged with exquisite restraint. It was a gift chosen not for love but for display, a token meant to silence questions before they could be formed. The weight of it settled upon her hands like judgment. Her mother smiled with visible relief. Such generosity, she declared, proved His Grace's devotion beyond doubt. Arabella inclined her head in agreement, though her pulse quickened. The pearls seemed to accuse her, as though they knew what price they demanded. Around her, the servants resumed their tasks, reassured by wealth's familiar language. No one remarked upon the faint tremor in her fingers as she closed the box. In that moment, she understood how easily truth could be smothered beneath elegance. Later that morning, a letter arrived in her cousin Lydia's hand. The script was graceful, the words impeccably chosen. Lydia expressed concern for Arabella's nerves and wished her joy in the life soon to begin. The letter contained nothing that could be called unkind, yet its civility rang with quiet triumph. Arabella read it once, then again, noting how every phrase avoided intimacy while asserting possession. Lydia had always known how to occupy space without seeming to intrude. Now, she occupied Arabella's future with the same ease. The Duke called shortly thereafter. His manner was composed, his voice steady, yet something in his eyes betrayed calculation rather than remorse. He spoke of obligations, of misunderstandings, of the necessity of discretion. Love was never mentioned. He did not deny what she had seen, nor did he apologize. Instead, he appealed to reason, reminding her of the consequences that would follow any public disturbance. A broken engagement, he warned gently, would destroy her prospects beyond repair. He framed her silence as an act of mutual protection. Arabella listened without interruption. She observed the way he stood, careful not to cross the room, respectful of boundaries now that secrecy had failed. When he finished, she thanked him for his honesty. The words tasted strange, but they served their purpose. He departed believing the matter contained the future preserved by her restraint. Only after the door closed did Arabella allow herself to sit, the weight of his certainty pressing upon her chest. She had become, in his estimation, a reasonable woman. The hours that followed blurred into a procession of final preparations. Florists arrived, seamstresses adjusted hems, relatives offered advice disguised as affection. Each interaction reinforced the same message: this wedding belonged to everyone but the bride. Arabella moved among them like a figure carved from marble, admired for her calm. Inside, however, her thoughts sharpened. She began to understand that compliance would not shield her from humiliation. It would merely postpone it, binding her to a life negotiated without her consent. By afternoon, rumors had grown bolder. A friend's glance lingered with inquiry. A whispered comment fell abruptly silent when Arabella entered a room. She realized then that discretion was a myth. The scandal already breathed beneath the surface, fed by curiosity and resentment. Her silence had not protected her reputation, it had rendered her invisible. The Duke's power lay not in secrecy, but in the assumption that she would never dare to contradict him. As evening approached, Arabella retired to the small garden behind the house, seeking air untainted by expectation. The sky darkened with impending rain, clouds gathering like an unspoken verdict. She stood alone among bare branches and winter roses, considering the narrow path before her. To proceed was to accept erasure. To refuse was to invite ruin. Yet for the first time, the choice felt unmistakably hers. The pearls, the letter, the warnings had clarified what duty demanded. Her heart, long disciplined into silence, began at last to speak, and its voice, though quiet, refused to be ignored. Rain began as Arabella Finch reached the edge of the garden, a fine mist at first, as though the sky itself hesitated to intrude upon her thoughts. She did not retreat. Instead, she welcomed the coolness against her cheeks, grateful for a sensation that belonged entirely to her. The house behind her glowed with lamplight and expectation, but here, among damp earth and winter-bare branches, she could breathe without performing gratitude. Each breath steadied her resolve, though she had not yet named it. A carriage rolled to a halt beyond the gate, its arrival unannounced and unremarkable, save for the singularity of the man who emerged. Mr. Edmund Hale was not expected that evening, nor was he essential to the wedding's pageantry. He was a distant relation by marriage, a man of quiet fortune and quieter reputation, recently returned from years abroad. Society found him agreeable but unmemorable, a figure who listened more than he spoke. Arabella had spoken with him only a handful of times, yet she remembered his attention distinctly. He did not approach at once. Observing her solitude, he paused, uncertain whether his presence would intrude. It was Arabella who acknowledged him first, inclining her head with polite recognition. He joined her at a respectful distance, remarking upon the weather with a simplicity that felt almost radical. There was no inquiry in his voice, no expectation of cheer. For a moment, they stood together in companionable silence, watching rain gather upon rose petals already bruised by cold. Edmund spoke then, not of the wedding, but of London's peculiar cruelty, how it rewarded spectacle and punished sincerity. His tone was measured, absent of bitterness, yet it carried the authority of observation. Arabella found herself listening with an attentiveness she had not granted anyone that day. He did not look at her as though she were fragile, nor as though she were fortunate. He looked at her as though she were present, and that alone unsettled her composure. She answered cautiously at first, offering generalities, testing the safety of his company. Edmund responded with patience, never pressing, never interrupting. Gradually, her restraint softened. She spoke of obligation, of how easily gratitude became a leash, of how women were praised most when they endured quietly. She did not name the Duke, nor her cousin, but the shape of the wound was unmistakable. Edmund listened without judgment, his expression neither shocked nor dismissive, only intent. When she faltered, uncertain how much truth propriety allowed, Edmund said quietly that dignity was not preserved by silence, but by choice. The words startled her. They did not promise rescue, nor did they counsel rebellion. They simply acknowledged her agency, a concept so rarely afforded that it felt almost unfamiliar. Arabella felt something within her shift, a subtle realignment, as though a door long sealed had been opened just enough to admit light. Their conversation moved indoors as the rain intensified, into a small library spared from the day's commotion. Shelves of leather-bound volumes absorbed sound, creating a hush that felt protective. Here, Arabella spoke more freely, admitting her fear of becoming an ornament in her own life. Edmund did not contradict her fears with assurances. Instead, he admitted his own experience of choosing comfort once, and regretting it for years. The confession carried no drama, only truth, and its simplicity lent it weight. He told her that courage, when genuine, rarely announced itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as exhaustion or resolve. Arabella considered this, recognizing the fatigue that had settled into her bones. She had mistaken it for weakness. Now, she saw it as the prelude to decision. Edmund did not urge her toward any particular course. He merely affirmed that whatever she chose should be hers alone, uncoerced by fear or flattery. As the evening deepened, the sounds of preparation resumed elsewhere in the house, reminders of time's insistence. Arabella rose, thanking Edmund for his candor. He bowed, not with deference, but with respect, and assured her that whatever dawn brought, she would not face it unseen. The promise was modest, yet it resonated. She watched him depart, aware that his presence had altered the landscape of her thoughts without demanding anything in return. Left alone once more, Arabella approached the window and observed the rain-soaked street below. Carriages passed, bearing guests eager for tomorrow's spectacle. She felt no panic, only clarity. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time, it did not feel predetermined. Somewhere within the quiet chambers of her resolve, a decision took shape, unannounced but inevitable. Tomorrow would still come. The bells would still ring. Yet she understood now that their sound need not dictate her fate. Morning broke clear and cold, the rain washed from London streets as though the city wished to appear innocent. Arabella Finch rose before she was summoned, her decision settled with a calm that surprised her. She dressed without assistance, fastening each button deliberately, as if reclaiming ownership of her body. When she looked into the mirror, she saw not a bride, but a woman resolved. Fear remained, but it no longer ruled. She carried it like a secret blade, hidden, steady, prepared to cut cleanly when the moment demanded. Silence followed her movements, lending gravity to every breath she took. The household stirred into ceremony, unaware that its purpose had shifted irrevocably. Arabella descended the stairs composed, meeting her mother's anxious gaze with gentle firmness. No explanations were offered, none requested. At the doorway, the Duke of Ravenscourt awaited her, immaculate, confident, already rehearsing triumph. He offered his arm. She accepted it lightly, not as surrender, but as strategy. Carriages rolled forward, bearing them toward St. George's, while London leaned closer, eager for spectacle, ignorant that it approached a reckoning carefully contained within her silence. Even the horses seemed restrained, sensing the weight of an altered destiny, waiting, watchful, patient. St. George's stood luminous beneath pale sunlight, its steps crowded with expectation and whispered conjecture. Inside, polished pews and floral arrangements framed a future assumed, not questioned. Arabella felt every eye measure her composure, mistaking stillness for obedience. The Duke leaned close, murmuring reassurances meant for witnesses rather than hearts. She answered with courtesy alone. When the clergyman began, his voice solemn and unyielding, Arabella listened intently, absorbing each word as if it were a final test of truth. Around her, silk rustled softly, prayers hovering like restrained breaths. Time itself seemed to pause, awaiting her response. From everyone present. When asked to consent, Arabella's voice carried clearly, though it trembled once, deliberately. She spoke not of devotion, but of truth, stating calmly that she could not proceed in honor. The words fell with devastating restraint. Murmurs rippled, quickly stifled. The Duke stiffened, disbelief eclipsing his polish. He protested softly, invoking duty, sacrifice, necessity. Arabella met his gaze steadily and replied that necessity without respect was merely captivity. In refusing, she claimed herself before society could deny her. Silence followed, heavy, irrevocable, as reputations shifted within that sacred space. No bell rang louder than her decision that morning. At last. The aftermath unfolded swiftly yet strangely muted, as though decorum muffled outrage. Arabella's mother stood rigid, grief and pride warring silently upon her face. Guests avoided direct glances, uncertain whether they had witnessed disgrace or defiance. The Duke withdrew, dignity unraveling in increments too small to disguise failure. Arabella felt no triumph, only relief sharpened by consequence. She had stepped beyond protection, into uncertainty, and the knowledge steadied her. Loss was inevitable, but self-betrayal had been refused, publicly, permanently. She breathed deeply, allowing the weight of freedom to settle. It was unfamiliar, frightening, and unmistakably hers alone. Forever changed now. Outside, the crowd dispersed in confused fragments, whispers igniting like sparks. Arabella emerged composed, her spine straight, her expression unashamed. Edmund Hale waited among the periphery, exactly where she expected him to be. He offered no applause, no rescue, only presence. She paused beside him, acknowledging his quiet solidarity with a look that conveyed gratitude and resolve. Together they walked a short distance, not fleeing, merely departing. The city observed them differently now, uncertain how to categorize a woman unclaimed. Carriages passed slowly, drivers staring, gossip already rearranging its judgments. Arabella felt lighter with every step taken forward. Without regret. They stopped near the square, where ordinary life resumed with stubborn indifference. Edmund spoke then, quietly affirming that courage had been witnessed, regardless of consequence. Arabella replied that being seen had altered everything. She did not speak of love, nor did he suggest it. Their understanding required no promise. What mattered was choice freely exercised. She would face censure, exclusion, uncertainty. Yet she would also possess integrity intact. That knowledge replaced despair with purpose, transforming scandal into beginning rather than ending. The future remained unwritten, but she welcomed its honest uncertainty. For once, fear bowed to intention. Quietly, decisively, enduring. By afternoon, the tale had already transformed, embellished by distance and desire. Arabella did not correct it. She returned home alone, declined consolation, and dismissed unnecessary counsel. In solitude, she removed the pearls and placed them aside, stripped of authority. She recognized grief would come later, but it would arrive honestly. Standing at the window, she regarded London not as judge, but as terrain. Survival required navigation, not submission. Her worth no longer required confirmation. She had authored her refusal, and in doing so, reclaimed narrative control. This understanding anchored her against storms yet to arrive. She did not waver. Evening settled, and with it a stillness unmarred by anticipation. Arabella lit a single candle, allowing its flame to define the room's limits. She reflected not upon what was lost, but what had been avoided. Marriage without respect, affection without honesty, survival without self. The cost of refusal remained unknown, yet it felt proportionate. She sensed that paths once closed might open differently now. The world had not ended. It had simply revealed its contours more truthfully. With clarity came restraint, and with restraint, a steadier form of hope. Arabella rested, knowing tomorrow would demand courage again. She would answer. Night deepened, carrying whispers beyond her reach. Arabella lay awake briefly, then slept without dreams of rescue. She required none. The choice she had made would echo through salons and seasons, reshaping how she was spoken of, remembered, resisted. Yet history often softened such moments, polishing defiance into legend. She accepted neither condemnation nor praise, only consequence. In an age that measured women by compliance, she had chosen authorship. Tomorrow would begin quietly, but its silence would belong to her. Thus ended a wedding that never was, and began a life. The city slept, unaware it had been changed. Forever.